Hi there, everyone. It's Justin here. I'm just going to give you a quick presentation, resource presentation on Dylan Williams' article, The Right Questions the Right Way. So I'm just touching on some of the high-level points of this article, but it's fairly short. So I would advise that you give it a quick read because I did find it very well written and really practical. Uh, so one of the quotes that I think sums up his argument in a nutshell is the teacher asks a question, several students raise their hands, the teacher selects one of those with a hand raised, the student gives a response, the teacher evaluates. Just about every aspect of this scenario actually gets in the way of learning. So that scenario he describes, right? I think if a lot of people you were to ask what happens in a classroom, they'd probably describe that scenario of students with their hands raised. But the position he's taking is that actually every single thing about that scenario is flawed. So what he does in the article is he touches on why it's flawed, and then he offers some alternative suggestions of how teachers could actually um, make better use of that teaching modality. So what's the problem? What's the problem with that scenario he discusses? Well, the first problem with it is that student participation is voluntary. So what he says you end up getting is mostly the engagement of confident students because they're the ones that are raising their hands. So they get engaged in the discussion. They're participating actively in their learning, and as a result, they're getting smarter. Whereas the others who decline the invitation to participate, well, they miss out on the learning opportunity. And the Matthew effect he's talking about there is actually a biblical reference of Matthew 25:29. And the passage reads, "For the one who has will be given more, and he will have more than enough. But the one who does not have, even what he has, will be taken from him." So the idea is that in asking students to put their hands up if they have the right answer, in a way what you're actually doing is just preaching to the choir. The other problem that he indicates is that it's not an accurate assessment of the whole class understanding. It's too small a sample. So if teachers are looking to find out whether or not the classroom has actually grasped whatever the concept is, asking the students, okay, so who knows the answer to this question? Even if you get two or three kids that get the answer correct, well, it, that doesn't mean that the whole class really understands what's going on. So you can't really say, okay, everybody understands and we're moving forward. So it's not an accurate assessment of whole class understanding. And the third thing he talks about, and we'll get more into getting into the intricacies of what he's talking about here, but that teachers tend to use unplanned questions. So even though they'll put together a teaching plan for that day, they won't necessarily think through what questions am I going to ask to find out if the students fully grasp the concept. So they tend to be asking these questions kind of impromptu, kind of off the cuff, and because of that, they might not be thinking through how they're asking those questions. So the responses that they get back might not actually show whether or not the students understand what's going on. They might get the whole class get the answer correct, but they might be arriving at that correct answer for the wrong reasons. The teachers aren't understanding what's happening with the students cognitively. But we'll touch on that in a little bit. So what do we do instead? What do we do instead? Well, there's three things he talks about. The first thing is adopting a no hands up policy. He says that students should be chosen at random, and that raised hands should really only be used for questions within the classroom setting. He says that we should be using a randomization device, and he talks about how there are software options for that, but in truth, names on tongue depressors is the best way to go. Because he says even when you as a teacher think that you're choosing students at random, that you're not even always aware of your own bias. So a randomization device is a good idea. He also talks about, I don't have a bullet for this, but he talks about how at times choosing students at random, some educators and teachers will not choose students in particular because they think the question that's being asked might be either too easy or too complicated for that particular student. And he argues that there's a danger in doing that as well. Even though you think you've got the student's best interests at heart, that bias is actually becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, that you're not giving that student a chance to either succeed or, quite frankly, to be upfront and honest about something they're confused about. You might think, well, this student's very bright. Obviously, they'll understand this, but they might actually be wrestling with it. So being able to choose students at random, completely, I don't know, by luck or democratically, I suppose, that's the best option. He also talks about posing a question first, then selecting the student, which I mean is totally logical. As soon as if you select a student and then ask the question, well, all the other kids might not engage cognitively in the question because they think they're off the hook and they're not going to have to answer the question. And then actually he discussed the benefit of foregoing questions entirely in a way in favor of statements to which the students are expected to respond. So the idea here is that dialogue is better than single sentence responses to questions. So one example he gives is, instead of asking individual students to answer a math question, maybe write 4 or 5 math questions on the board, and then as the teachers say, you know what, I think question number 2 is the most complicated question on the board. What do you think? And posing it to the class that way and getting them to engage in the discussion about that. You're not actually necessarily looking for just the answers to those questions, but more so getting them to talk about the concepts that are involved, and then you get a better understanding as a teacher. Are they understanding the concepts, not just the answer? How are they arriving at that answer? So it's a way of like verbally showing their work. He also uses an example from a history class where if you're talking about the Second World War, say, instead of saying what was the outcome of the Second World War, you could say something like, make the argument that, I actually think that Britain was the ultimate victor of the Second World War, or Russia, or America, and then leaving it open to the class to have a discussion about that. So it's not a black or white. It's not a binary answer. It's something that's open for discussion. And as an educator, you get a better sense of where everybody's at when there is that kind of discussion. And also, people are better able to get you're better able to get the entire class involved. A good quote of his from this article: if students are answering every one of the teacher's questions correctly, the teacher is surely wasting the student's time. If questions are not causing students to struggle and think, they are probably not worth asking. One of the things I liked about William's article is that he's got a really nice writing style. It flowed really well, and he framed what I think are a lot of self-evident truths in ways that you could really kind of hold on to them, and this was one of those quotes. It makes perfect sense, but I think probably educators would find ourselves in those traps of feeling like we're getting unanimous responses back to things, and that's kind of gratifying. We're like, okay, they get it, we're moving forward. But if you're spending a lot of your time asking questions and getting unanimous correct responses back, well, where's the benefit in that? So that's no hands up is the first point. The second one is he suggests using all student response systems. He talks about the benefit of whole class interactions, like we just did with the dialogue discussion. So some of these all response switch systems would be like ABCD cards, or I think more popular than that are dry erase boards. In a university setting, a lot of undergrad courses that have got very large lectures are using clickers that they'd sell with textbooks as a way to engage the entire class in the learning. But in a smaller class setting, probably dry erase boards are a better way to go. The use of multiple choice questions, he says, is obviously very valuable, but multiple choice questions being hard to come up with on the spot, so making that something that's pre-planned. Also talks about how if you're not wanting to use multiple choice questions, but you want longer answers or even short answer, because if you've got 30 kids holding up short answers on whiteboards, it can be hard to quickly scan the room and get a feeling for where everybody's at. He talks about how you could hand out index cards to the students and get them to write down their answers on those cards, write their name, and use it as an exit pass. So on their way out of class, when they're done writing that answer, they just hand that to you. Then you're able to go through those and assess where the class is at, and you can actually tailor your next plan, your next teaching plan to that lesson plan, to those responses, and maybe even set up the seating plan based on that. The third thing he talks about are planning the questions. Typically, teacher questions are created in the moment, not pre-planned with the lesson plan, which we talked about earlier. Questions may not reveal important aspects of student thinking. Sometimes common student misunderstandings can go undetected due to flawed questions. Now, he gives a couple examples of this, but one of the ones that I thought was pretty apt was in like a pretty basic science for kids in primary grades. They might equate what is a living thing with what is something that moves. So if you were to ask them, of these three things, which is not alive, rocks, cats, and birds, the entire class might say, well, rocks aren't alive. That's the correct answer, but what you won't find out is that a third of the class thinks that the reason why a rock isn't alive is because a rock doesn't actually move. So you might get all the right answer and think, good, great, they get it, and move on from that concept, but the question is flawed. Whereas if you were to ask them, buses, computers, and trees, which aren't alive, the second they say that trees aren't alive, you've realized that there's something off in their comprehension and their understanding there. And I think this is another reason why the idea of engaging students in dialogue might be better than asking simple questions, or even a combination of those two things. And he kind of sums up the concept here with another, I think, pretty great statement. If students with the right thinking and students with the wrong thinking give us the same answer, the question is not particularly useful, which is very self-evident, but I think really true. So the idea of pre-planning those questions in advance of the lesson can be helpful, because you can really think through some of those, the best way to find out what the student's actual thinking, what their actual understanding is of the concepts. So in summary, too often classroom questioning and discussion involve only confident students and fail to give teachers an accurate picture of student comprehension. So he advocates for these three things: employing a no hands up policy, where you choose students at random, make use of all student response systems, so you're engaging everyone, and pre-planning questions, discussion statements can help to ensure that teachers are tapping into students' actual understanding, and that they're not just getting the right answer, but getting it for all the wrong reasons. And that's it. That's the article in a nutshell. Again, if you've got 20 minutes, I'd advise giving it a read, because it was good. It was interesting, and thank you very much. Hope you're all having a great week. Bye.